Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. The Castro Files, Cuba, cocaine, and state control. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine moved from a regional commodity to a global industry. What began as fragmented smuggling operations in Colombia evolved into a structured pipeline feeding the United States and Europe. At the center of this transformation was the Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, a network that understood one principle above all others. Routes mattered more than product. Cocaine could not move on violence alone. It required airspace that remained quiet, ports that stayed predictable, and corridors where interruptions were rare. As enforcement pressure increased on direct routes into the United States, traffickers began looking outward, toward geography that offered distance, cover, and strategic advantage. The Caribbean became unavoidable. Between Colombia and Florida stretched a constellation of islands, shipping lanes, and air routes. Some were loosely governed, others were heavily monitored. In this environment, traffickers did not seek disorder. They sought stability, places where movement followed rules, not improvisation. Cuba occupied a unique position within this map. 90 miles from the United States, positioned at the intersection of Caribbean maritime and air traffic, and governed by one of the most centralized security states in the Western Hemisphere. Its ports, radar systems, military installations, and intelligence services operated under unified command. During the same period, U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies were tracking unprecedented volumes of cocaine entering American cities. Investigations expanded beyond cartel figures to logistics, intermediaries, and transit zones. Case files, surveillance operations, and informant testimony increasingly focused not only on who produced the drugs, but on how they moved. By the mid-1980s, U.S. prosecutors were no longer examining trafficking as isolated criminal activity. They were examining systems. In courtrooms, congressional hearings, and investigative reporting, the idea of corridors began to take shape. Geographic spaces where movement occurred repeatedly, predictably, and with minimal disruption. These corridors were not defined by chaos, they were defined by control. It was within this context that Cuba began appearing in the historical record. Not as a defendant, not as a verdict, but as a recurring point of reference, sometimes in indictments involving third parties, sometimes in intelligence assessments, sometimes in testimony that described movement rather than command. At the same time, inside Cuba, the state maintained a rigid narrative of sovereignty and discipline. Revolutionary authority was inseparable from national security. Borders were not porous. Airspace was not casual. Nothing of strategic significance moved without oversight. This combination, geographic relevance and centralized control, placed Cuba in a unique position during the height of the cocaine era, not as an open question, but as a closed system observed from the outside. What that system did, permitted, or prevented during those years would later become the subject of testimony, trials, and unresolved debate. But before allegations, before defenses, and before conclusions, there is only the map. And on that map, power did not belong solely to those who produced cocaine. It belonged to those who controlled the route. By the mid-1980s, U.S. investigations into cocaine trafficking were no longer confined to street arrests or cartel leaders. Prosecutors and federal agents were assembling case files that followed movement. Flights, vessels, refueling points, and contacts that appeared repeatedly across unrelated investigations. These files were built slowly, through wiretaps, informants, surveillance logs, and intercepted communications. Investigators began mapping how cocaine moved once it left Colombian airstrips. Patterns emerged that did not depend on a single cartel or a single year. The same corridors appeared again and again. One of the cases that drew attention to the Caribbean involved traffickers accused of routing cocaine through island territories rather than attempting direct entry into the United States. In recorded conversations and investigative summaries, references surfaced to protected airspace, reliable maritime passage, and locations where operations proceeded without interruption. At the center of many of these narratives were intermediaries, pilots, brokers, maritime coordinators, and facilitators whose role was not to sell drugs, but to move them. These figures rarely spoke in ideological terms. They spoke in logistical ones. They discussed fuel, timing, clearance, and assurance. It was within this investigative environment that Cuba began appearing in U.S. case material. Not as a charged party, but as a location named in testimony, surveillance summaries, and informant debriefings. Sometimes the references were indirect. Sometimes they were explicit. What they shared was consistency. Journalists following these cases noted the same pattern. Reporting described allegations that cocaine shipments passed near or through Cuban-controlled zones en route to other destinations. These reports did not present verdicts. They presented claims being examined by investigators. Former members of the Medellin cartel would later describe similar arrangements in interviews and memoirs. Among them was John Jairo Velázquez, known as Popeye, who had operated inside Pablo Escobar's organization. He described routes that depended on predictability rather than evasion, and transit areas where movement occurred without interference. Such accounts added narrative detail to what investigators were already documenting, that large-scale trafficking required environments where risk was managed not by chance, but by structure. At the same time, U.S. officials acknowledged limits. Much of what was being described involved territory outside American jurisdiction. Evidence could be collected, analyzed, and compared, but not fully tested in foreign courts. Files accumulated without resolution. By the late 1980s, the record contained a growing body of material. Indictments of third parties, taped conversations, intelligence assessments, and press investigations, all pointing toward the same unresolved question: how routes functioned in regions defined by strong state control. No conclusions were drawn in these files. They were archived, referenced, and revisited. What remained was a documentary trail, not of guilt or innocence, but of repeated mention. The files did not speak with one voice, but they spoke often enough to be preserved. And in archival history, preservation itself carries weight. In 1989, the narrative surrounding Cuba and narcotics shifted from external allegation to internal action. That year, the Cuban government announced a military investigation that would culminate in a nationally televised trial known as Causa Number 1. For the first time, Cuban authorities publicly acknowledged that senior officials had been involved in drug-related crimes. At the center of the case was General Arnaldo Ochoa Sanchez. Ochoa was not an obscure figure. He was one of the most decorated military commanders of the Cuban Revolution, celebrated for his role in international missions and widely recognized within the armed forces. His prominence gave the proceedings immediate national significance. Alongside Ochoa were officers from the Ministry of the Interior, including Antonio and Patricio de la Guardia. According to the charges presented, the defendants had engaged in corruption, abuse of authority, and collaboration with foreign traffickers. The prosecution described a network that facilitated illicit operations while operating within state institutions. The trial was broadcast across Cuba. Transcripts were later translated and archived. Viewers watched as prosecutors presented confessions, documentation, and reconstructed timelines. The state framed the case as evidence of vigilance, a demonstration that no individual, regardless of rank, stood above revolutionary discipline. Within the proceedings, references were made to contacts with Colombian traffickers and to operations that extended beyond Cuba's borders. The language emphasized betrayal and deviation, portraying the accused as having acted against the interests of the state. The verdict was swift. Ochoa and several co-defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. The executions were carried out shortly after the trial concluded. Cuban media described the outcome as necessary to preserve national integrity and to sever any link between the revolution and criminal activity. Internationally, the trial was closely watched. Foreign governments, analysts, and journalists examined the proceedings line by line. Some focused on what the trial revealed. Others focused on what it did not address. The fact that Cuba itself had publicly prosecuted senior figures marked a rare moment of visibility inside a closed system. The official record of Causa Number 1 stands as one of the few instances in which the Cuban state documented narcotics-related activity within its own ranks. It remains preserved in archives, not as interpretation, but as testimony delivered under state authority. What the trial established was clear. Cuba acknowledged a problem and defined its boundaries. What lay beyond those boundaries was not addressed. The files closed, the sentences were carried out, and the official narrative was set. After the conclusion of Causa Number 1, the Cuban state presented the case as closed. The executions of Arnaldo Ochoa and the Interior Ministry officers were described as decisive action against corruption and criminal deviation. Official statements emphasized that the matter had been identified, prosecuted, and resolved. Within Cuba, the message was unambiguous. The revolution had defended itself. The system had corrected an internal breach. Responsibility had been assigned and discipline restored. Outside the island, the trial entered a different phase, not as a legal process, but as an object of analysis. Governments, scholars, intelligence agencies, and journalists examined what the proceedings revealed and how they were structured. Attention turned to the scope of the accusations and the limits of what had been publicly disclosed. Some analysts focused on the unprecedented nature of the trial. A senior general and high-ranking security officials had been placed on public display, accused of serious crimes and punished at the highest level. In this reading, the trial represented a deliberate effort by the Cuban state to confront illicit activity within its own institutions. Others examined the same record and noted its boundaries. The proceedings concentrated on individual responsibility rather than institutional authorization. The narrative emphasized betrayal rather than policy. References to higher command structures were absent from the official charges. What remained constant across interpretations was the structure of the system itself. Cuba's security apparatus, military ports, and intelligence services operated under centralized command. Oversight was hierarchical. Authority flowed upward. Decisions of consequence were rarely decentralized. In this environment, the trial served multiple functions simultaneously. It documented criminal conduct. It demonstrated enforcement. It also defined the limits of accountability, identifying who would be named and who would not. International investigations did not follow. No external jurisdiction was granted access to Cuban records. No independent inquiry reviewed the trial's conclusions. The official version remained the only version formally preserved by the state. Meanwhile, outside Cuba, testimony and intelligence assessments continued to circulate. Files accumulated. Hearings were held. Reports were written and archived. None resulted in a judicial forum capable of reconciling internal proceedings with external allegations. By the early 1990s, the immediate focus of global narcotics enforcement shifted. The Medellin cartel fractured. New routes emerged. Attention moved elsewhere. But the Cuban record remained fixed in time. A single, highly visible moment followed by silence. The trial had spoken, and then the system returned to opacity. By the time the cocaine era of the 1980s receded into history, the record surrounding Cuba had taken its final shape. It was not a record defined by verdicts across multiple courts, nor by international rulings. It was defined by fragments, trials that ended internally, files that accumulated externally, and questions that were never placed in the same room. What is established is narrow but solid. Cuba prosecuted and executed senior officials in 1989 after a televised military trial that accused them of corruption and involvement with drug trafficking. That trial exists in transcript, video, and official state record. It represents the only formal judicial action taken inside Cuba related to narcotics at the senior level. There is no court, domestic or international, that ever convicted Fidel Castro of drug trafficking. No indictment was filed, no trial was held, no independent investigation was permitted to examine state authorization, command responsibility, or institutional policy beyond what the Cuban government itself presented. What exists outside the courtroom is testimony. Former members of the Medellin cartel, including individuals who operated close to Pablo Escobar, described cocaine routes that depended on controlled environments in the Caribbean. Investigators documented allegations that Cuban-controlled zones were used as part of these routes. Intelligence agencies assessed these claims and preserved them in classified and later declassified records. These accounts were never tested in a Cuban court. They were never reconciled with the conclusions of causa number 1. They remain statements without cross-examination under a shared legal framework. This is where the line must be drawn. Testimony is not a verdict. Intelligence assessment is not proof. Silence is not exoneration. An absence of jurisdiction is not confirmation. In open systems, allegations move toward resolution through courts, discovery, and challenge. In closed systems, they often remain suspended, neither confirmed nor disproven, preserved only in archives. The contrast becomes clear when viewed alongside later history. In Venezuela, similar allegations evolved into indictments, sanctions, and ultimately arrest. The difference was not the nature of the claims, but the availability of legal access. Cuba never allowed that access. As a result, the historical record surrounding Fidel Castro and cocaine trafficking does not conclude with guilt or innocence. It concludes with control. Control over information, control over process, control over which questions could be asked and which could not. What remains is not a judgment, but a boundary. On one side, what was proven, broadcast, and closed by the state itself. On the other, what was alleged, documented, and left unresolved beyond its reach. This is not the story of a verdict. It is the story of a system where the record ends exactly where authority decides it should. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.